Hi everyone, and welcome back to Minds and Machines with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So last time, if you recall, we talked a little bit about the modern understanding of the mind that emerged around the middle of the 20th century. And it's the same picture of the mind that continues to inform a lot of work that psychologists and cognitive scientists and neuroscientists and so on still do today in the 21st century. So I introduced the modern understanding of the mind, and modern as in the colloquial vernacular sense, not the modern period, which was actually several hundred years ago. Anyway, today what we're going to do is go back in time, and we're going to start talking about conceptions of the soul that we find in classical Greek philosophy. So we'll be taking a look at Plato's Meno today, the dialogue Meno, which you were all to read. But before we do that, I just have a few housekeeping things to announce. I've posted slides for this lecture and for the previous lecture, and I will likely continue to post PowerPoint slides. These are slides that I would have used were I to teach this class in a live setting. But for now, you can think of these slides as kind of like my lecture notes. And you can feel free to add to those, say by printing them out and, adding your own notes in the margins or something if you like. I recommend, basically, this is a roundabout way of saying that I recommend that you do take notes for this class, because there are times when I forget to put something important in the slides and I just, recall it while I'm lecturing and then I mention it. So, do take notes. And also, we are seeking a volunteer note taker for this class. The Paul Menton Center has contacted me, and I've reposted their announcement on the discussion boards on See You Learn, so go and take a look. But basically, the volunteer note taker would be required to submit their notes, and those notes will be shared with students who aren't able to take handwritten notes, for example. So if you're interested in doing that, if you take really nice notes and you're interested in earning some credit, extracurricular volunteer credit, which will appear on your Carleton transcript, you can contact the Paul Menton Center. Everything you need to know is in my announcement on See You Learn. Contact them, volunteer, share your notes, and that would be great. I would be very appreciative if one or two of the students in this class volunteered to do that. All right, so that is it for the housekeeping material. Before we talk about Plato, his views of the soul, and what we read in his dialogue Meno, we need to talk a little bit about what was going on philosophy-wise in ancient Greece. So the first part of this lecture is going to be designed to kind of get you up to speed on the essential background, the historical and philosophical background to what we're going to be talking about. Then the second half will be spent on discussing the relevant bits of Plato's dialogue, the Meno, the bits that are relevant in the sense that they deal with questions that we're interested in here, the bits that deal with the nature of knowledge and the soul. So with that said, let's get started. So as you know, this is a philosophy class, and you may already know the root of this word. It comes from the classical Greek. Philosophy, or philosophia, as they would have said way back in the day in ancient Athens or someplace like that, means love of wisdom. It comes from these classical Greek root words, philia, which means love. It means kind of like a familial or filial love, like the love between a family member or a close friend. And Sophia, which means wisdom. So philosophy is love of wisdom. I'm going to be throwing a lot of old Greek terms at you today. You needn't worry about memorizing them. I'm just giving you these terms because they're good to be aware of in a first year class. Because if you decide to get, further into ancient philosophy, you might want to have this vocabulary, right? So I'll be throwing terms like Sophia and philia and logos and arete and all these ancient Greek words. I'll present them in the slides transliterated, so they're not written in the ancient Greek alphabet. They're given in English and rendered, the way we think that these words would have actually sounded. We actually don't know how ancient Greek really sounded because we weren't there. But anyway, you'll learn some of these terms today. So we need to get acquainted with these terms and a little bit of the historical and philosophical background. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about what was going on in ancient Greece with respect to the kind of inquiry that we're going to be looking at here. We're going to look briefly at the pre-Socratic philosophers. Pre-Socratic philosophers, sometimes these are called physicos, or this means like a natural philosopher, someone who studies nature, or physis, right? So we meet the pre-Socratic philosophers who were interested in very different kinds of questions compared to what Plato was interested in. We'll also meet the Sophists. The Sophists were an interesting bunch and probably concerned Plato and Socrates more than the pre-Socratics and their work did. And then finally, we'll meet Socrates, at least the Socrates that Plato presents in the Meno, and we'll talk about Plato himself. So that's kind of the plan for today. Now, I'll begin with this quote from Alfred North Whitehead, the famous 20th century philosopher, who said, and I quote, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." And yeah, that's a pretty good way of putting it. But that's not to say that there wasn't any philosophy going on before Plato. I mean, Socrates was Plato's teacher, and he was a philosopher, so there must have been some philosophy going on. And it turns out there's actually quite a rigorous philosophical tradition that we find in ancient Greece, going all the way back to the 6th century BCE, or before Common Era. It all started with the Pre-Socratics. I mean, before this, the Greeks were very much all about understanding the world as a chaotic place that was governed by the whims of the gods, right? How did they explain, the origins of things? They explained it via mythos, myths, the kind of thing you'd read in Homer, for example, that kind of thing. So the world was a chaotic place. But in the 6th century BCE, along came a thinker named Thales. Now, Thales was from Miletus, which I believe is in modern-day Turkey. He was a mathematician and natural philosopher who figured out how to do all kinds of interesting things. He could predict solar and lunar eclipses and the movements of the planets. He did geometry, and he theorized about what the fundamental origins of all things are. What is this primordial substance, if there is one, out of which everything is made? And what is that substance like? The Greeks thought of this kind of, primordial substance or essence of being as arche, the origins of all things. So Thales and other pre-Socratic philosophers were very much all about understanding the origins of everything in existence, the ordered whole of existence, or what the Greeks would call cosmos. So, Thales believed, incidentally, that the fundamental substance that made up all things was water. He was wrong about that, but what was really important about what he was doing here was the fact that he sought a non-mythological explanation, a naturalistic explanation for all the things that we see in the world, the ordered whole that is the cosmos. So Thales thought it was water, but of course Thales wasn't the only pre-Socratic philosopher in town. We also had Anaximander, who was a student of Thales. He thought water was too particular of a substance to really explain the origins of everything, He thought, well, how could rocks and trees and birds and people all be made out of water? Doesn't make any sense. So Anaximander instead posited that arche was actually something that the ancient Greeks would call a purion, which means sort of infinite boundlessness, right? Anaximenes, another student of Thales, posited that the fundamental substance or primordial substance, the arche, was in fact air. There was also Pythagoras. I'm sure you've heard of Pythagoras. You've learned about the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras was a famous mathematician who pioneered geometry and who formalized Greek music theory. And he was very interested in the idea that there is harmony and order in the cosmos. You see this in mathematics and you see this in music. So it's no surprise that Pythagoras thought that the fundamental origins of everything was in mathematics and geometry and numbers, right? There was also Heraclitus. Heraclitus was a bit of a hermit who thought that everything in reality was characterized by change. You might have heard this expression, you never step in the same river twice. Well, that's kind of a riffing on Heraclitus's quote, in the same rivers we step and do not step. What Heraclitus means here is that the primordial substance, the arche, the origin of all things, is in fact change itself. And there was also Parmenides. Parmenides thought that rather than change itself, the fundamental substance was being itself, not particular beings like me or my dog or trees, but just being itself. That might sound a little weird and abstract, so we're not going to spend too much time on it, but just keep in mind, he thought that arche was not a particular kind of thing, but existence itself, if you like. Now, what all of these pre-Socratic philosophers had in common was that they are substance monists. That is, they believed one kind of substance explained everything in the cosmos, everything that is. So they were all substance monists, and this will come in handy, knowing this term, substance monism. This will come in handy later when we start talking about modern thinkers like Descartes. But not all pre-Socratic philosophers were substance monists. Some were substance pluralists. So the substance monists, like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes and Heraclitus and Pythagoras and so on, they all believed one kind of substance explained everything in existence. They differed on what that substance was. Thales thought it was water. Pythagoras thought it was mathematics and numbers and so forth. So they disagreed about what it was, but they all believed it was one thing. The substance pluralists believed in many different substances, of course. So there was Empedocles of Sicily, for example. Empedocles believed that everything was made out of 4 fundamental elements. You may have guessed what they are: earth, air, fire, and water. Anaxagoras imagined instead that there were infinite fundamental substances, which he called something like seeds or germs. And this would sort of foreshadow philosophical developments in the modern period, particularly those of Leibniz, who believed that everything in reality was made up of monads, which are very much like Anaxagoras' seeds or germs. Coming a little bit closer to the beginning of the classical period, we have Democritus, who was from a place called Abdera. And Democritus was actually a contemporary of Socrates, and he visited Athens, although he tells us that nobody recognized him when he went to Athens. So it's unlikely that he and Socrates ever sat down and conversed. But Democritus thought that everything was made of atoms and void. Not atoms as we understand them today, not, little things, little bits of stuff that are made of protons and neutrons and electrons. No, rather Democritus thought that atoms were, fundamental, individual, indivisible bits of matter that couldn't be split. What atoms were for Democritus would really be more like what quarks are for physicists today. And everything else was void, the space in between the atoms. So Democritus obviously didn't understand atoms like we do today. But that is where the word atom comes from adamas, or indivisible in ancient Greek. So all of these philosophers, these pre-Socratic philosophers, whether they were monists or pluralists, wanted to understand the cosmos, and they did so by appealing to logos, which here means reason, rational principles. It can also mean true speech or true words. Logos is translated many different ways, but these are some of the ways it's translated. These are some of the things it meant to the ancient Greeks. And the pre-Socratic philosophers wanted to understand the ordered whole of existence, the cosmos, nature, according to rational principles, not according to mythos. And in this way, the pre-Socratic philosophers were really a lot like scientists. In fact, the kinds of things that they did were done well into the modern period, studying nature and trying to identify rational principles. And before we coined the term science, which I believe was coined in the 19th century, we called these folks natural philosophers. Thales, Democritus, they were natural philosophers. Isaac Newton was a natural philosopher as well. So now you know a little bit about the Pre-Socratics. The Pre-Socratics operated from the 6th century BC till about the 5th or 4th century BCE. They wanted to understand the cosmos according to rational principles, according to logos. Let's understand the ordered whole of nature. It's not all chaotic stuff going on out here. The fall of every sparrow is not attributed to Zeus or any of the other gods. No. The world can be explained according to rational principles. And there was a fair bit of disagreement on how to best explain the world, but they all agreed that that was the approach they ought to take. That was one kind of philosophy that was going on in the Greek peninsula way back in the day. But there was another kind of philosophy that was practiced as well. It was practiced by a group that have come to be known as the Sophists. So the Sophists are wise ones. Remember, Sophia, wisdom. So the Sophists are the wise ones. But perhaps a more accurate term would be like wise guys. And you'll see why in a moment. The Sophists, not to jump ahead too far, were often accused by Socrates in Plato's dialogues of making the weaker argument the stronger. Perhaps a bit like sketchy lawyers, right? If you think to yourself of like a Lionel Hutz or a Saul Goodman type character, you kind of have an idea what a sophist might have seemed like to Socrates or Plato. If you think of some of these, I don't know, conservative pundits on Fox News might also be a great example. I mean, I don't want this to get too political here, but yeah, you've got those people making the weaker argument the stronger a lot of the time. So that's probably what a sophist would have seemed like to Socrates and Plato. But there were actually lots of different types of sophists. There were, for example, sophists of culture. The sophists of culture tried to stimulate the young minds of Athens and of all the Greek city-states. Protagoras and Gorgias were sophists of culture. And Gorgias was actually a teacher of Meno, who Socrates converses with in the dialogue that we're going to look at later. Protagoras, we'll come back to him in a moment, but he was a famous relativist. I'll explain what that means shortly. There were also encyclopedists. So these sophists were concerned with like organizing knowledge and categorizing knowledge, making encyclopedias essentially that would go in libraries, big scrolls in libraries that might tell you about the customs and ways of life of other Greek city-states, or, if you wanted to know what life was like in Persia, you go to the library, you grab a scroll, maybe it was written by Hippias, for example, was an encyclopedist. You grab a scroll and read all about Persia. And that's because of the encyclopedist sophists who were interested in putting together information like this. And then finally there were the sophists of Eristic. These sophists specialized in debate and discourse. They were rhetoricians, basically. They would charge a fee and teach you rhetoric, teach you how to argue, perhaps even to make the weaker argument the stronger. They would teach you oratory skills. And these people were very sought after, because to participate in public life in ancient Greece, whether we're talking Athens, Sparta, or any of the other city-states, you had to be able to do what? Use your rational speech. You had to have logos to participate in public life. You had to have a lot of other things too. You had to be an older male who owned property. Women, slaves, children had no say in public life in ancient Greece. But not only did you have to be male and own property, you also had to be able to read, write, and speak. You had to be able to show that you weren't stupid. So these were very sought after skills in ancient Greece, and the Sophists of Aristotle were the ones who would teach these skills. So we can see a kind of different, couple of different camps here, right? Pre-Socratic philosophers valued knowledge for its own sake, but Sophists, not so much. They often claimed that they were wise enough to teach anyone anything, as long as they could pay up. A pre-Socratic philosopher wasn't interested in this kind of thing. Pre-Socratic philosopher just wanted to know how the cosmos worked, because knowledge was good in and of itself. But Sophists, they wanted to make some money here. So in that way, I guess I am a little bit like a sophist as well. Not to pick on the crappy lawyers and Fox News pundits, but I'm sitting here getting paid to teach you things. I'm kind of like a sophist myself. But the sophists back in ancient Greece, they would travel from place to place around the Greek peninsula. So we're talking about around the Aegean Sea, into Turkey, maybe getting close to Italy, around there. And they would teach the young folks what life was like in different city-states, teach them how to argue. But the sophists that really upset people were the individualistic sophists who preached a kind of relativism and individualism. These were not traditional Greek values back in the day in the ancient Greek city-states. Relativism, is this kind of thing where there is no objective truth. That's what relativism means. There is no one single truth. And some of the philosophers, like Pythagoras, were very relativistic. Pythagoras said, for example, that man is the measure of all things, of existing things that they exist, and of non-existing things that they exist not. How do we know what's real, what's true, what's false, what really exists and what doesn't? We say what exists and what doesn't. That's what Pythagoras says. Humans are the arbiters of what is true and what is not. That's very different from the Pre-Socratics, who questioned the mythology. How does the world work? Well, the gods, obviously, right? They questioned that, and they figured out that, well, it's not random chaos controlled by the gods. It's an ordered, reasonable cosmos that we live in, and we can figure out if we study it. No, the sophists disagreed. They were very relativistic, and they also preached a kind of individualism, which, again, kind of flew in the face of traditional classical Greek values. In ancient Greece, they were much less individualistic than we are today. Ancient Greeks lived in city-states, as I've mentioned. The city-state is called the polis. This is the root of our word for politics or policy. All of these words are cognate with polis. So polis means city-state. Athens was a city-state. Sparta was a city-state. All the ancient Greek city-states you've heard of, they would have called them polises back in the day. Little kind of autonomous kingdoms that governed themselves, but were all united by, the same language and history and mythology, which you can read about in Homer, for example. So in ancient Greece, the polis was everything. The polis was a bit like a beehive, right? Men were expected to participate in public life. That was their duty, sort of towards the city, not towards their own selfish interests. Likewise, women were expected to be obedient to their husbands, but they ran the household, or the oikos. The oikos or oikos is actually the root of our word for economics. How about that? Slavery was a thing. It wasn't chattel slavery like slavery in the modern period was. It was a different kind of slavery than the slavery that existed in the Americas, for example. It still wouldn't have been all that pleasant. Slaves didn't have rights, but you were expected to treat your slaves well, teach them, give them an education. Slaves could, of course, earn their freedom. Slaves were very much like, in a way, they were a part of the family, almost like adult children. In another way, and I apologize if this seems dehumanizing, but in another way, I imagine the Greeks viewed them as very much like beloved pets. They certainly loved their slaves, sometimes figuratively and literally, and they were like part of a family, but they didn't have the rights that citizens had. So ancient Greece was not an individualistic place, and the Sophists kind of preached that you should be more individualistic sometimes. You can see this in satire, satirical plays, for example, that were written at the time by Aristophanes. Aristophanes portrays Socrates as a sophist, teaching a kind of individualism and relativism to his students. And it does not go well for the students or for their families. So, anyway, spoiler alert, by the way, Socrates would go on to be accused of being a sophist. He'd be tried and executed for corrupting the city's youth and for preaching about the non-existence of the city gods. So, not to get ahead of ourselves, things don't turn out too well for Socrates. But anyway, now we have a pretty good picture of the Pre-Socratics and the Sophists. Now we want to talk a little bit about the classical period in ancient Greece before we move on to talk about the important bits from the Meno. So let's take a look at the classical period now. Now, the classical period in ancient Greek philosophy is characterized by the work of the big three. That is Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates was a teacher of Plato. Plato was a teacher of Aristotle. And Aristotle would go on to teach none other than Alexander the Great, if you can believe that. So that's quite something. And the classical period is generally understood to be, to cover from the mid-5th century to the mid-4th century before Common Era. Before Common Era, or BCE, by the way, is just a kind of secularized way of saying before Christ. It's the same year. 0 BC and 0 BCE are the same year. We just call it the Common Era to kind of secularize it a bit. So anyway, Socrates was the first of these three. He was born in 470 BCE and died in 399 BC. And Socrates was a bit of an oddball. He never wrote anything down. He had lots of students who would like to listen to him as he walked around the agora, or the town square, which was where public life would happen in ancient Athens. And he would walk around there, maybe with some wine, often with kind of dirty robes and not wearing any sandals. Socrates didn't bathe too much. He kind of looked perhaps a little scruffy, right? Didn't really take care of himself too well because he didn't care about that stuff. He only cared about knowledge, right? So Socrates didn't write anything down, had lots of students, but he didn't charge money like the Sophists. He wouldn't charge for his teaching. He lived in Athens, as I've already mentioned, and most of what we know about him, because he didn't write anything down, actually comes from the work of other writers. These are philosophers like his students, Plato and Xenophon, or a contemporary playwright like Aristophanes, who used Socrates as a character in his plays, much like Plato and Xenophon used Socrates as a character in their dialogues. Now, Plato wrote an awful lot about Socrates. In fact, if you're reading about Socrates in an undergraduate class like this one, you're more than likely reading a dialogue written by Plato where Socrates features as a character. And in these dialogues, we get Socrates just having a back and forth conversation with someone. Most of Plato's dialogues are like this, and Socrates is the main character in these dialogues. And long after Socrates died, Plato continued to use the character of Socrates. And we think that Plato's earlier dialogues are probably more reflective of what Socrates, the real Socrates himself, thought. And later dialogues are probably more reflective of Plato's own ideas. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, Socrates' mother was a midwife. A midwife, helps to deliver babies. Back in the day, there were physicians too, but it was hard to be a physician. But there were lots of midwives. It was a very important profession, obviously, because women and children face a significant risk, both of dying during childbirth, especially before modern medicine. So it's very important to be a midwife and have midwives around. Socrates' mother was one of these, and Socrates likened himself to a midwife, a kind of intellectual midwife who would help others give birth to their own ideas, to their own knowledge. Socrates would go around, asking people questions, and we see this in the Meno. Most of the questions in that dialogue are not asked by Meno, but by Socrates. So he asked basic questions about everything, about truth, justice, how to live a good life, all kinds of things. Socrates thought that this was the best way to uncover knowledge. The best way to knowledge is to have someone ask you these questions so that you birth your own ideas, your own knowledge. As we'll read in the Meno, Socrates and Plato believed these ideas, whatever knowledge you have, whatever ideas you can come to or that you already have, already exist. They already exist in your mind and already exist out there in perhaps some kind of metaphysical beyond or some perfect world of ideas. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. But Socrates believed that by asking the right questions, he would get people to remember things or realize things that they already knew, right? And this method of teaching is called dialectic, which is cognate with the word dialogue, right? A kind of back and forth question and answer kind of discourse. This has come to be known as the Socratic Method, and it's probably one of the coolest ways of teaching anybody anything that anyone's ever come up with. I really like it, and I still like to use it when I have a sort of question and answer exchange in one of my classes. It's too bad we can't do that now because classes aren't live. So you're missing out on the Socratic Method, I suppose. You'll just have to read about it in the Meno. But anyway, Socrates would practice this dialectic by asking people questions and getting people to kind of realize that they do not know what they think they know. And you see this in his dialogues. Socrates would do this and lead people into a state of kind of numbness or confusion or aporia. That's what the ancient Greeks would have called it. Once the interlocutor realized they did not know what they think they knew, then Socrates would say, then they're in a position to really learn something, or to more accurately recollect something. This is where Socrates can really help them birth their ideas via what, as we'll see, is a kind of recollection, or what the Greeks called anamnesia. You notice, recall, remember, anamnesia sounds like amnesia, aperivative, amnesia, without forgetting. You see how many words in modern day English are cognate with ancient Greek words. Pretty cool. So unlike Socrates, who did not write anything himself, Plato wrote lots and lots and lots of stuff, lots and lots of dialogues and so forth. Now, we don't know precisely when Plato was born. It could have been around 428 or 427 BCE, or it could have been around 424, 423 BCE. It depends who you ask. We know that he probably died around 348 or 347 BCE. He traveled a lot. He was well traveled. He was a nobleman, unlike Socrates. Socrates was not wealthy, but Plato was very wealthy. And Plato could afford an education. And he was, in fact, a student in the Pythagorean tradition, as well as a student of Socrates, although Socrates wouldn't take any of his money. Plato would go on to found one of the first universities in the world, the Academia, or the Academy. He founded this in 387 BCE in Athens, and it would last until it was destroyed by the Romans in 86 BCE. Such a shame, Romans. And above the doors of the Academy was engraved words in ancient Greek, Agiometritos medis esito, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. We don't actually know. What that means, roughly speaking, is not even one person untutored in geometry may enter here. So you can see Plato was a student in the Pythagorean tradition, and he was very big on geometry, and we'll see that some of Pythagoras' ideas are reflected in Plato's own theory of the forms. There's my dog barking. Hang on a second. As I mentioned, Plato had many students, but he would go on to teach perhaps one of the most influential thinkers in the entirety of human history, and that is Aristotle. Aristotle is perhaps the most influential philosopher in human history, and he would go on to teach Alexander the Great, who was himself, depending on who you read, whether you read the Greeks or whether you read someone else, was either a great general or a barbaric conqueror. In any case, very cool. Some of the other things that Plato's noteworthy for are his ideas, like those we find in the Republic, which is one of his longest dialogues. The Republic is a very long series of dialogues, really, that tries to explain how to achieve the ideal society. We're not going to talk about that much, but if you ever find yourself reading the Republic, you may be struck by how dystopian it all actually sounds. It contains Plato's famous Allegory of the Cave, which unfortunately we're not going to have time to talk about today, but I may give it a little bit more attention next time. In the Allegory of the Cave, we learn a lot about Plato's metaphysics, his theory of reality, and about his epistemology, his theory of knowledge. We learn a little bit about that in the Meno and the Phaedo as well, though. And that's why we're going to read those. We learn some important things about his theory of reality, his theory of knowledge, and what he thinks about the nature of the soul. And remember, it's not 100% clear how much of what we're getting in the Meno and the Phaedo is original Socrates and how much of it is Plato kind of inserting his ideas in there and using Socrates as a mouthpiece. We're not exactly sure, but for our purposes, that doesn't matter all that much. Some of the things that we'll learn from these dialogues is that Plato believed in something called the tripartite soul, a soul with three parts. The soul has, kind of a rational part, the rational soul. That's where we have our reason, our logos, right? We also have a spirited soul. This is the part of the soul that governs emotions or the passions, right? We also have an appetitive soul. Desires, physical needs, and stuff like that are the province of the appetitive soul. So we're talking hunger, thirst, the desire for sex, drugs, and rock and roll. These are all the province of the appetitive soul. And to live a good life, Plato would say, we need our rational soul, the part of the soul that has logos, to rule over the appetitive soul and the spirited soul. It's a bit like the rational soul is the driver of a chariot, and the spirited soul and the appetitive soul are the horses. That's the analogy he uses in the Republic. You want your rational soul to be like a good chariot driver who can manage his wild, powerful, appetitive, and spirited soul. I had to look at the slides again there. Now, as we'll see in a little while when we finally get to Aristotle, Aristotle also believed in his own version of the tripartite soul. But we'll look at that when we read De Anima, or On the Soul, by Aristotle next week. For now, I think I've given you more than enough background to understand what was going on. So I'll just do a little bit of recap, and then we'll dive into the important parts of the Meno. Right, so far we've talked about the Pre-Socratics, we've talked about the Sophists, and we've talked a little bit about Plato and Aristotle kicking off the classical tradition in ancient Greece. So now let's turn to the readings, the Meno. This is a dialogue that was completed at 380 BC, and it features four characters. It features Socrates, features Meno, or sometimes Menon, Meno's slave, who doesn't have a name in the dialogue, and another character named Ananesis. So, what's happening in this dialogue, and why on earth did I have you read it? If you've already read it, you may have wondered as you were perusing through the beginning of it, why on earth I chose this. But we can actually learn a lot about what Plato thought about the soul and about knowledge from this dialogue. So, what's going on here? Well, Meno is a student of the sophist Gorgias, who I mentioned earlier. Gorgias was a sophist who preached a kind of, individualism and relativism, appealing to young minds. And Meno is described as a good student of him. He's a younger fella. He's, good looking. He's got a kick-ass chariot. He's like a young, eligible bachelor type, right? And Socrates makes several passes at him throughout the dialogue. I don't know if you noticed that, but, that's another fact about ancient Greece. So Meno says to Socrates, "Can you teach me," and I'm paraphrasing here, "what virtue is and whether it is teachable?" That's one of the only questions, compared to Socrates, that Meno actually asks. Socrates does most of the question asking in this dialogue, as you'll see. But he asks Socrates to kick things off, what is virtue? What is arete, as the ancient Greeks would have called it? Arete, often translated as virtue, but also can mean a sort of excellence. And really this is what virtue means anyway, right? A sort of excellence. So, what is this virtue, this excellence, and can we teach it? And Socrates, typical Socrates, says, you know what? I don't know. I don't know anything, really. I'm Socrates. Why don't you tell me, Meno, what virtue is? So Meno explains what he thinks virtue is, and he names many different virtues. Men, women, children, slaves, all have different virtues. Men, Meno says, might possess the ability to govern the state. Women to govern the household. Children and slaves might not have very many virtues, but perhaps one would be obedience, for example, right? But Socrates isn't satisfied with this answer. Socrates is saying, hold on, Meno, you're telling me about lots of different virtues, but I want to know what virtue is. I don't want you to say this is a virtue, that's a virtue. I want to know what virtue is in and of itself. Can you tell me that? Socrates uses the analogy of a beehive. He's saying like, okay, these are all these virtues are like bees. So what is it that makes all these bees like one another? They're all alike in some kind of essential bee kind of way. And I want to know, I want to find that thing for the virtues. I want to pinpoint, the common thing that all virtues participate in, or that they all share. And Meno proposes that maybe, then, virtue is just the desire to achieve good things, and the ability to achieve them. So, earlier where Socrates is, kind of accusing Meno of making many out of one, I'm asking you about virtue, Meno. I want to know what you think virtue is, and you're breaking that apart and giving me this virtue and that virtue, all of these different virtues. But what is virtue in itself? You need to tell me that. And Meno says, well, I guess it's just the desire to achieve good things and the ability to achieve them, right? But Socrates isn't satisfied here either, because people, he points out, can fail to recognize evil. So they might desire evil things that they erroneously believe are good. So this can't be what virtue is, because people might not recognize the good versus the evil and what is good and what is evil, right? People can be ignorant of the good. So this isn't going to cut it for Socrates. So Socrates still wants to know, what is that thing that's common to all of these virtues that Meno was mentioned earlier? What is it by virtue of which they are virtues? And Meno's kind of stumped, right? Meno feels pretty stumped here. He feels like he's just been, hit by a torpedo fish. Socrates is the torpedo fish, and Meno is feeling quite torpid or numb. He's in a state of confusion. He doesn't know what to do next. And he lets Socrates know, how he's feeling and how this seems kind of like, we're not getting anywhere, Socrates. What are we supposed to do? We got a problem here, Socrates. We can't proceed like this. And this problem that Meno tries to point out has since become known as Meno's paradox. So Meno's feeling perplexed. He's feeling numb. It's like Socrates is a torpedo fish and he's made Meno go all torpid. He has no idea what virtue is now. He's in a state of confusion or aporia. Socrates says to Meno, "I perplex others, not because I am clear, but because I am utterly perplexed myself. And now I know not what virtue is, and you seem to be in the same case, although you did once perhaps know before you touched me. However, I have no objections to join with you in the inquiry about virtue." Meno replies, and this is the paradox, "And how will you inquire, Socrates, into that which you do not know? What will you put forth as the subject of inquiry? And if you find what you want, how will you ever know that this is the thing which you did not know? How can you inquire about something you don't know, Socrates, if you don't know about it? How will you know when you know about it if you don't know what you're looking for?" That's Meno's paradox. Socrates replies, "I know, Meno, what you mean, but just see what a tiresome dispute you are introducing. You argue that man cannot inquire either about that which he knows or about that which he does not know. For if he knows, he has no need to inquire, and if not, he cannot, for he does not know the very subject about which he is to inquire." Meno says, "Well, Socrates, and is not the argument sound?" To which Socrates replies, "I think not." So Meno's complaining like, okay, look, maybe I don't know what virtue is, and you don't know what virtue is either, Socrates, but how on earth are we going to learn what virtue is? How can we inquire about it if we don't know what it is? If we already knew, we wouldn't have to inquire about it. But since we don't know, we can't inquire about it because we won't know when we find that essential feature of virtue that is common to all of the virtues. "No problem," says Socrates. And here's where we get to Plato's theory of recollection. About midway through the dialogue, after Meno has introduced his paradox, Socrates replies, saying that he's heard from priests and poets about the nature of the soul. And he says, "The soul, then, as being immortal, and having been born again many times, and having seen all things that exist, whether in this world or in the world below," that's Tartarus, the underworld, often erroneously called Hades, "has knowledge of them all. And it is no wonder that she should be able to call to remembrance all that she ever knew about virtue and about everything. For as all nature is akin, and the soul has learned all things, there is no difficulty in her eliciting, or as men say, learning, out of a single recollection. All the rest, if a man is strenuous and does not faint. For all inquiry and all learning is but recollection, and therefore we ought not to listen to this sophistical argument about the impossibility of inquiry, for it will make us idle, and is sweet only to the sluggard. But the other saying will make us active and inquisitive. In that confiding, I will gladly inquire with you into the nature of virtue." So Socrates is saying here, well, look, I've heard from people that know lots about the gods, that the soul is immortal. Whether Socrates actually ever heard this from anyone, we don't know. This is very much Plato's theory. But Socrates says the soul is immortal and it doesn't really die. When we die, the soul kind of goes to the world of the pure forms, the world of ultimate reality for Plato. This is called the transmigration of the soul, and it's an argument that Plato is putting forward for innate knowledge. Socrates is basically saying here, there's no learning, there's only recollection, because the soul has already had contact with true reality. But we forget because of the trauma of birth. So we don't really learn things, we just have to recollect them. So he's saying knowledge is really innate. It's present from birth. And this will become an important theme as we continue on throughout this class. So we forget our knowledge, episteme, our knowledge, that we got from our encounter with ultimate reality, with the world of the forms. And we forget this because of the trauma of birth. What are the forms? You've probably heard of Plato's idea of the forms, or Plato's theory of ideas. A form or an idea comes from the Greek word eidos, for that which is seen, is like the most real thing. And there's forms for everything. There's forms for the good, the true, and the beautiful. There's forms for cups and tables, right? There's forms for everything. And the forms are the real things in themselves, what the Greeks would have called the noumena, the things as they are in themselves. The things that we encounter in the world, like this cup, this isn't like the form of cupness, it's like but a shadow or a mere appearance of this form of the cup. So what the Greeks would have called phenomena, that which is seen, right? Or not that which is seen like an idea, but that which appears in the world. And it's a shame we don't have time to talk too much about the allegory of the cave, because that's really the main point of that allegory. We have prisoners in the cave, and they mistake shadows on the wall for reality. The shadows are mere appearances, not the way things really are. I'll link you to an article about the allegory of the cave in case any of you would like to take a look at it. So, knowledge needs to be recollected, not really taught, according to Socrates and Plato. And this is what Socrates is trying to do as a sort of intellectual midwife. He's trying to get you to birth, that is, recall this knowledge that your soul already possesses. This process is called anamnesis. Remember? Recollection. Anamnesis. And Meno's like, whoa, okay, cool, but will you show me, Socrates? Of course, I'm paraphrasing here. But Meno is asking for a demonstration, and Socrates says, of course, I'll demonstrate recollection to you. And he asks for the help of Meno's slave. And this is a very famous part of this dialogue, and we're going to take a little close look at it now. So Socrates needs to demonstrate recollection to Meno, so he asks Meno's slave boy to come and give him a hand by doing a little geometry. I always feel a little bad just calling him slave boy, but he's not given a name in this dialogue. Let's call him Bob. Socrates and Bob are doing some geometry. Socrates has a stick and he can draw figures in the sand on the ground. And he draws these squares. I'm going to put a picture up here so you can see the kind of thing that's going on here. Because unfortunately it's not depicted in the dialogue that I've linked you to on the internet. So Socrates and Bob are drawing squares. Socrates draws a square, the pink square in the corner here. And he says, so this square is 2 feet by 2 feet, so it's 4 square feet. He's asking the slave this. Yeah, no problems. Yes, Socrates, that's 4 square feet. Yep, makes sense to me. And he's like, what would we have to do, Bob, if we wanted to turn this square that's 4 square feet into a square that is 8 square feet in area? And the slave provides some answers. He says, well, Socrates, we'll have to double the length of the side. So if we have a 4 foot by 4 foot square, that'll be our answer. Well, of course, that's wrong. 4 times 4 is 16. So that can't be the right answer. That's much too big. We need a square that's half that area. So the slave says, well, okay, then it's 3 feet, right, Socrates? Nope. You can see just by looking at this diagram that if we were to have a square that was 3 feet by 3 feet, well, that would be 9 square feet. That's 1 more square foot than we're looking for here. So the slave, Bob, feels a little perplexed, just like Meno did. But that's all right. That's not a bad thing. Socrates here has made Meno's slave confused. He's introduced him to a state of aporia by asking him questions. And it's important to note that this slave, Bob, unlike the students of Plato's academy, was untutored in geometry. Meno confirms this in the dialogue. You know, Socrates says, "Hey, is Bob Greek?" "Yes." "Does he know geometry?" "No, Socrates. He was born in my house. He speaks Greek. He's a Greek person. But I never taught him any geometry, you know. He never learned any of that." So, you know, no wonder the slave couldn't answer Socrates' questions. But here's where the magic happens. Socrates is like, now that your slave is confused, you know, don't worry. Your slave's going to be okay. Bob's going to be fine. It's not a bad thing to be confused. It's actually a good thing. Because now Socrates can birth those ideas. So he can get Bob to recollect his knowledge of geometry. He can do some ananesis. So Socrates draws more squares. You know, he doubles or quadruples rather the area of the pink square. So now we have the pink square and the 3 white squares. We have quadruple the area. And he's talking to Bob as this is going on, right? He's saying, so if I make this line 4 feet long and this line 4 feet long, well, then the square is 16 square feet instead of the original 4 square feet. Isn't that right, slave boy? Yes, by Zeus, Socrates, you're right. You know, the dialogue kind of proceeds this way. Socrates then draws these blue diagonals, cutting the original square in half, halving the area, and getting the slave to agree that the area here that's contained within the blue lines is double the area of the original square. That is the pink square. So they found their answer. What would we have to do to make this 2 foot by 2 foot square have double the area? Take this 4 square foot area and turn it into an 8 square foot area. And the square here contained in the blue diagonals has that area, it possesses that area. Now, was this really recollection? Well, take a second look at this part of the dialogue and decide for yourselves. I don't think it's a really convincing demonstration of recollection at all. It's up to you to decide. And remember, you know, according to Meno, his slave, Bob, is untutored in geometry, although he is fluent in Greek. He doesn't know any geometry. And Socrates, just by asking him questions, has ostensibly gotten him to recall knowledge of geometry from his, I suppose, his soul's encounter with ultimate reality, where we have forms of numbers and forms of geometric figures and these kinds of things. You know, there's a form of a perfect form of a square and a circle and everything in this ultimate reality for Plato. Socrates says, but if he did not acquire the knowledge in this life, knowledge of geometry that is, then he must have had and learned it at some other time. Meno says, clearly he must. Socrates replies, which must have been the time when he was not a man. Yes, says Meno. Socrates continues, and if there have been always true thoughts in him, both at the time when he was and was not a man, which only need to be awakened into knowledge by putting questions to him, his soul must have always possessed this knowledge, for he always either was or was not a man. Meno says, obviously. Socrates replies, and if the truth of all things always existed in the soul, then the soul is immortal. Wherefore be of good cheer, and try to recollect what you do not know, or rather, what you do not remember. So Socrates says, look, I've just demonstrated it, Meno. I've just proven that the slave boy, Bob as we're calling him, has recollected knowledge of geometry. No one's taught him this, but I've just asked him the right questions, and I've gotten to help him give birth to these ideas in the mind, give birth to this knowledge or episteme in the mind, just by asking the right questions. Lead them to a state of confusion, and then do that intellectual midwifery that Socrates is all about. I personally think that Socrates, or rather Plato, is having Socrates tip his hand a little bit. If you reread this part of the dialogue, and I suggest you do, you can see that most of the questions Socrates is answering the slave are just simple yes or no questions, right? So Socrates is saying, if I draw this diagonal, the blue lines, well, then I've halved the area of the large square. Haven't I, slave boy? By Zeus, Socrates, you have. This kind of thing. Meno's slave is kind of answering like a yes man, or perhaps like a slave who's afraid of giving the wrong answer. Now, whether you think this is a convincing example or not is not really the point. It's just meant to illustrate Plato's theory of recollection. And, whatever you think of it, this is probably one of the most famous passages from one of the most famous dialogues in the Western philosophical tradition. So reread it again just for that purpose. Why not? So, back to virtue. Well, later on, another fellow comes in and joins the conversation. His name is Ananesis. Ananesis is an Athenian politician, and he would actually be one of Socrates' prosecutors later on. Socrates would go to trial for corrupting the youth of Athens and for denying the existence of the city gods and preaching the existence of new gods. So, together, Ananesis and Socrates kind of inquire about whether virtue is knowledge. If virtue is a kind of knowledge, then maybe we can teach it, or rather, get people to recollect it. So they talk about this for a little bit, and then Socrates turns back to Meno, and they decide, well, before we answer this question, we have to work out what the difference is between knowledge and true opinion, right? That's important. If virtue is knowledge, well, what's the difference between somebody who has knowledge of virtue and someone who just happens to have an opinion about virtue and happens to have the correct opinion about what would be the virtuous action, or what a virtuous person would do, or what the right thing to do is, or how to achieve good ends, right? So on and so forth. And this is where we encounter another important aspect of Plato's epistemology, or his theory of knowledge. And this is known in the present day as the justified true belief account of knowledge. So in this part of the dialogue, we get another sort of back and forth exchange between Socrates and Meno. We'll start with Socrates. Meno is asking him here, what is the difference between having knowledge and having right opinion? What is even the difference, Socrates? Tell me. Socrates replies, you would not wonder if you had ever observed the images of Daedalus, but perhaps you have not got them in your country, because Meno's not from Athens. Meno replies, what have they to do with the question? Socrates says, because they require to be fastened in order to keep them. And if they are not fastened, they will play truant and run away. Well, what of that, replies Meno. First, a little bit more context. You may have heard of Daedalus, or Daedalus, the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. Daedalus was a craftsman of legend who made wings out of wax and feathers for he and his son so that they could fly. Now, Icarus, his son, flew too close to the sun. There's a lot of suns in that sentence there. Anyway, Icarus flies too close to the sun, and the wax that holds the feathers onto his wings melts, and he falls to the earth in his hubris, his defiance of the gods. The sun isn't just a sun in ancient Greece. The sun is, carried across the sky by a god, Apollo. So he's getting cast back down to earth in his arrogance against the gods. That's what hubris means. But anyway, Daedalus, in other legends, was also a legendary craftsman, and he would make images, not like paintings, but statues. And in these legends, the statues or images of Daedalus were said to be so lifelike that if you didn't fasten them down, they'd get up and run away. So that's what Socrates is saying here. He's saying, if you know about these images of Daedalus, you know why knowledge is different than true opinion. Meno's perplexed by this. What do you mean, Socrates? Socrates goes on to explain. I mean to say that they are not very valuable possessions if they are at liberty, for they will walk off like runaway slaves. But when fastened, they are of great value, for they are really beautiful works of art. So he's saying that knowledge is kind of like the images of Daedalus. It needs to be fastened down by something. Otherwise, it'll be like a true opinion and could just get up and walk away. Socrates continues. Now this is an illustration of the nature of true opinions. While they abide with us, they are beautiful and fruitful, but they run away out of the human soul and do not remain long, and therefore they are not of much value until they are fastened by the tie of the cause. And this fastening of them, friend Meno, is recollection, as you and I have agreed to call it. But when they are bound, in the first place, they have the nature of knowledge, and in the second place, they are abiding. And this is why knowledge is more honorable and excellent than true opinion, because it is fastened by a chain. Meno, after hearing this, sort of recants and says to Socrates, what you are saying, Socrates, seems to be very much like the truth. Now, in more modern terms, this is the justified true belief account of knowledge. What we would say in more modern language is, if you have knowledge, you need these three things. You need to have a belief in something. Let's say A. We'll just say A. Belief in A. A could stand for anything like, a sentence like the earth is round, okay? Or the earth is a sphere. So one has knowledge if one has a belief in A, and if A is true, and if you have justification for believing that A is true. This is what Socrates was talking at earlier. The tie is the cause. Your justification for believing what you believe is what fastens down your opinions and makes them knowledge. So to make it a bit more concrete, let's take believing the earth is a sphere. One has knowledge that the earth is a sphere if one believes the earth is a sphere, if it's true that the earth is a sphere, and finally, if one has justification for believing that the earth is a sphere. Perhaps you've read it in a science textbook. Typically today we use justification to mean some kind of evidence, right? Or some good reason to believe what you believe. But in Socrates' and Plato's epistemology, the justification is recollection, right? If you recall, you fasten down your opinions and you make them knowledge, right? So the difference between that and true opinion is that true opinion, you have a true belief, you believe in A and A is true, but you don't have a justification for it. That's why, opinions are more like the images of Daedalus. If you don't fasten them down with justification, a tie to the cause or recollection, they could just get up and walk away out of the soul. All right, so we've learned most of what I wanted to cover from the Meno. We've learned about Plato's theory of recollection, a little bit about his epistemology or theory of knowledge, a little bit about what he thought about the soul. But what about virtue? Well, I'm not going to say too much about that, but Socrates, just to give you the sort of summary of the end of the dialogue, Socrates is skeptical that we can teach virtue. Virtue might not be a kind of knowledge, according to Socrates. Virtue might be more like a divine gift, right? He says, then Meno, the conclusion is that virtue comes to the virtuous by the gift of God. God with a capital G. That's another interesting thing about Plato and later Aristotle. They started talking about a God that's maybe a bit more like the God you're used to if you come from a Judeo-Christian Islamic background. This is not the traditional Zeus type of God. This is a more Platonic type of God. But in any case, Plato and Socrates are saying here, well, maybe we can't teach virtue. It's something divine. It's like when the priest receives a vision from the gods, the virtuous receive their virtue from the gods, and we can't teach it. Of course, that's what he says here. In other dialogues, Socrates' tune kind of changes a little bit. For example, in the Apology, which is Plato's account of Socrates' defense at his trial, Socrates says to the Athenian jurors, if I am convicted and if I am to die for my city, so be it. I love Athens so much that if you guys say I am to be executed, I will be executed. But make sure my sons have arete. Make sure my sons are virtuous, excellent people. Make sure they're good citizens of Athens. And that would seem to imply that Socrates thinks virtue can be taught. In any case, we'll see a little bit later that Aristotle, unlike Plato, definitely thought virtue could be taught. He wrote a whole book about it for his son, Nicomachus, about how to live a good life and be a good person, called the Nicomachean Ethics. But just like the Sophists, we're not going to be too concerned about what virtue is and whether it is teachable in this class. We're more interested in Plato's theory of knowledge and his theory of the soul. And we've gotten a pretty good picture of that so far from the selections we've read from the Meno. So, reread the relevant sections. I encourage you to do that. It's a very good idea. It will help shore up your knowledge. If you have not read it yet, please do. And if you wish, you may focus in on the selections that I've highlighted here. But again, I do encourage you to read the whole dialogue. It's really not that long, and it's a good read. It is a classic in the Western canon. Everyone should read this dialogue. Please read it. Don't fall behind on your readings. Okay? Okay. So what have we learned about today? Well, we learned about what was going on in ancient Greece, starting in the 6th century BCE. What were these Greek thinkers doing 2,600 years ago? Well, starting with Thales and the Pre-Socratics, they were inquiring about nature. They were inquiring about the cosmos, trying to understand the cosmos, the ordered whole of existence using logos, reason, rational principles, true speech. The Sophists, on the other hand, were much more about individualism and relativism. The Pre-Socratics were interested in knowledge for its own sake. The Sophists taught you knowledge so that they could make some money. We learned a little bit about the classical period, when it started, mid-5th century, carrying on to mid-4th century. And we learned a little bit about Plato and Socrates. Socrates was a teacher of Plato. Plato also was a Pythagorean. He wrote lots of dialogues, and we learned about his theory of knowledge and his theory of the transmigration of the soul. And we learned that Plato thought that knowledge, or episteme, comes from the soul's direct encounter with the world of the forms, this ultimate true reality for Plato, where the things in themselves, the noumena, the forms exist. Everything in this world is mere phenomena or mere appearance, like shadows on the wall of the cave, which is linked below if you want to take a look. Now, because of the trauma of birth, we don't remember all this knowledge, but we can if we have somebody ask us the right questions. We can do some ananesis and recollect this knowledge. So there is no teaching, there is only remembering. The consequence of this is that knowledge on Plato's epistemology is innate. Knowledge is there from birth, indeed, before birth. And this idea of innate knowledge is actually something that's very much still with us today in the cognitive sciences, as we'll see when we reach the end of this class. So as you can see, some of Plato's ideas about the mind and about knowledge, or not the mind, but the mind soul, if you like, are very different from what we're used to. But there's also some similarities there too. And if you look closely, you can spot them. You can see how Plato's had an influence on the intellectual tradition, and why Alfred North Whitehead described the Western tradition as a series of footnotes to Plato. This has certainly not been an exhaustive look at the Meno by any stretch of the imagination. If I were doing a class on ancient philosophy, I would probably spend a couple of classes at least on this dialogue. But we're not inquiring about everything that Meno and Socrates are inquiring about here. We're just interested in the nature of the soul and knowledge, and we've taken a look at those sections today. Next time, we're going to learn more about those very same topics by diving into another of Plato's dialogues, the Phaedo. You can access that link in the slides on See You Learn and below in the description. The Phaedo takes place after Socrates is tried for corrupting the youth and essentially preaching a kind of atheism. You know, Socrates was accused of teaching the youth not to worship the gods of the city, like Athena and those gods. And he said, or was accused of saying, you know, just follow your own gods. The reason Socrates said this, by the way, was very interesting. It basically has to do with Socrates claiming to have a daimon, or a little spirit or god inside him who would talk to him. We're going to get into that more next time. But as you'll see, after the trial, Socrates is found guilty. He's convicted by a jury of his peers, and he is sentenced to die by drinking hemlock. Hemlock is a poison that kills you in a very nasty kind of way. So the Phaedo is Socrates' conversation with his friends while he's awaiting execution. You'll learn more about Plato's epistemology, more about Plato's theory of recollection, a little bit more about the life and death of Socrates. All right, so that is all for today. I'm sorry that this lecture took a little while to get posted. Things just kind of got away from me over the weekend. I was going to say that Wednesday's lecture will probably be, the same sort of thing. It will be up on Wednesday, but it will not be up at 11:30 a.m. It will just be uploaded on Wednesday, and I will try to catch up so that the other lectures go live at 11:30. But if you ever wake up on a Monday or a Wednesday and go to watch the lecture and it's not there at 11:30, don't panic. Chances are I've just fallen a little bit behind given all the crazy COVID-19 stuff that's going on right now. Okay, so that is all for today, and I look forward to talking about more Platonic philosophy and more about Socrates on the soul and on the nature of knowledge next time when we look at the Phaedo. Until then, I hope you all stay safe, and remember to get in touch with me in the comment section, via email, or on my Discord server if you have any questions about the material. That's all for now. I'll see you all next time. Bye for now, everyone.